Ambassador Alara Voss stood at the center of the grand chamber on Thessara Prime, surrounded by the towering seats of 42 alien species, and she kept her chin raised even though she already knew the answer she was going to receive. She had stood here before 10 times in 10 years, asking the same question, presenting the same evidence, making the same case with the same careful words that her predecessors had crafted long before her. "Honored members of the Galactic Accord Council," she began, her voice steady and clear across the vast hall. "Humanity once again formally requests the expansion of colonization rights beyond the Sol buffer zone, as was promised to us upon our induction 80 years ago." The chamber buzzed with murmurs, clicks, and wet gurgling sounds that passed for conversation among the assembled delegates. High Arbiter Thalvarin of the Valeth hegemony leaned forward from his elevated seat at the apex of the chamber, his scaled face splitting into something that could only be described as amusement, if amusement were a weapon. "Ambassador Voss," he said, and even the translation device could not hide the condescension dripping from every syllable. "Your species has been a welcome junior partner in this accord for a respectable period of time, but the Council has determined, again, that humanity has not yet reached the developmental threshold required for expanded territorial access." A ripple of laughter moved through the Valeth delegation and their allies. Alara did not flinch, but her fingers tightened around the data tablet she held behind her back, where no one could see them. "With respect, High Arbiter, we have met every benchmark set by this council," she replied, her tone measured and calm. "Our technology index exceeds the threshold by 14%. Our diplomatic conduct has been rated exemplary in every review, and our contributions to joint scientific endeavors have benefited no fewer than 12 species in this chamber." Thalvarin waved a clawed hand, as if brushing away an insect. "The matter is closed, Ambassador. We will not be holding a vote on this issue today, or any day in the foreseeable future." He did not even bother to look at her as he said it. Alara bowed her head in the customary gesture of acknowledgement, turned, and walked out of the chamber with her delegation trailing behind her in silence. When the doors sealed shut behind them and they were alone in the corridor, Commander Ravi Anand, her military attaché, exhaled sharply through his nose. 11 years, he said quietly, 11 years of this." Alara said nothing until they reached the human embassy wing, and even then she waited until the room was swept for surveillance devices before she spoke. "It was never going to be a yes," she said, pulling up a holographic display from her desk, "and we have always known that, but now I have something worse to report to command." She projected a series of intercepted communications across the wall. Intelligence gathered by deep cover operatives embedded in Valeth trade networks over the past 3 years. The messages were damning. They showed, in precise detail, that the Valeth and their closest allies had been mining and colonizing resource-rich systems just outside the Sol buffer zone, the exact systems that had been designated for humanity's future use under the original Accord Charter. They were not protecting humanity with that buffer, they were caging it. Ravi read the translations with a jaw that grew tighter with every line. "They have been stealing from us since before we were born," he whispered. "They have been stealing from us since the day they let us in," Alara corrected him. "The buffer zone was never a shield, it was a fence." She transmitted the full intelligence package to United Earth Command and the Terran Continuity Congress back on Earth, and then she sat down and waited for the response she knew would come. It came within the hour, a terse acknowledgement, a request for her continued presence on Thessara Prime, and a classified note from Fleet Admiral Jonah Mwangi that read simply, "Understood, hold position and maintain appearances." Alara closed the message and stared at the wall for a long time. She was tired not physically, but in her soul, in the place where hope lived when she had first taken this posting, believing that she could change things through words and patience and the slow grind of diplomacy. That place was almost empty now. 3 weeks passed, and the diplomatic routine continued as if nothing had changed. Trade meetings, cultural exchanges, the usual performance of interstellar cooperation that meant nothing underneath. And then the Galileo happened. The TCS Galileo was a deep space research vessel, not a warship, not a scout, not anything that could be mistaken for a threat by any species with functioning eyes. She carried 412 souls, scientists, engineers, support staff, and families. Yes, families, because humanity believed that exploration was not just for soldiers but for everyone who dreamed of the stars. The Galileo had been conducting long-range stellar surveys near the outer edge of the buffer zone, well within humanity's permitted space, when a Valith patrol fleet of 6 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel and opened fire without warning and without communication. The attack lasted 9 minutes. There were no survivors. When the distress beacon finally reached Earth, it carried the last transmission from Captain Yuki Tanaka. Not a cry for help, not a scream of terror, but a calm recording of the Valith ship's identification signatures and weapon frequencies, sent so that humanity would know exactly who had done this and exactly how. She had spent her last living moments making sure the truth survived, even if she did not. The Galactic Accord Council convened an emergency session 4 days later, after humanity filed a formal protest and demanded an investigation. Thalvarin presided over the hearing himself. The Valith representative presented their case with infuriating calm. The patrol fleet had detected an unidentified vessel in a contested navigational corridor and had responded according to standard security protocol. An unfortunate navigational misunderstanding, the representative concluded with a slight bow, for which the Valith hegemony expresses its regret. No reparations were offered. No officers were named or disciplined. No investigation was ordered. The Council voted 28-14 to accept the Valith explanation and close the matter. Alara stood in the chamber as the votes were cast and watched the numbers appear on the display above, and she felt something shift inside her. Not break, not shatter, but shift, the way tectonic plates move deep beneath the surface before an earthquake that will reshape the entire landscape. She said nothing, because there was nothing left to say to these people. On Earth, the memorial for the Galileo crew was broadcast across every channel on every continent and every orbital station, 412 names read aloud, one by one, while billions watched in a silence that was heavier than grief. It was anger, the kind of anger that does not burn hot and fast but settles into the bones like winter, cold and patient and absolutely certain. Fleet Admiral Jonah M. Wangi watched the broadcast from the bridge of the dreadnought TCS Resolve, orbiting high above the Pacific. He was 61 years old, and he had spent his entire career preparing for a war he hoped would never come, building something in the shadows that the galaxy did not know existed, because he understood a truth that the Council had never bothered to learn about humanity. They were not a species that forgot. They were not a species that forgave without justice. And they were never, not once in their entire blood-soaked history, a species that stayed down when someone pushed them to their knees. His second-in-command, Captain Lena Schultz, stood beside him as the last name was read and the screen went dark. "Sir," she asked quietly. Mwangi stared at the stars beyond the viewport and let out a slow breath. "They think we are still asking," he said, and his voice was so calm that it frightened her more than any shout could have. "We are not asking anymore." In the 6 months that followed the Galileo massacre, humanity did something that confused every intelligence agency in the known galaxy. They went silent. The trade delegation stopped arriving at Thesara Prime, and the human seats in every joint scientific committee sat empty, and the cultural exchange programs were canceled one by one with polite automated messages that said nothing of substance. At first, the council species barely noticed. Humanity had always been a minor presence in galactic affairs, easy to overlook, easy to forget. Like background noise in a crowded room that simply faded away. But then weeks turned into months, and the silence grew louder. The Rithani Collective, an insectoid hive mind species that paid attention to patterns the way other species paid attention to food, submitted a quiet inquiry to the council about the human withdrawal. Thalvarin dismissed it with a wave of his clawed hand. "The mammals are sulking," he told the assembly, and his allies laughed. "They will return when they grow hungry for the scraps we allow them. They always do." On the galactic networks, human space became a subject of jokes. The quiet herbivores retreating to their little cage around their little yellow star, licking their wounds and learning their lesson about challenging the natural order. Nobody looked closer. Nobody thought to ask what the silence was hiding. If even one species had sent a proper intelligence probe deep enough into Sol space, they would have discovered a truth that would have kept them awake for the rest of their natural lives. Humanity had been preparing for this moment for over 50 years. Deep beneath the frozen surface of Europa, in a facility that did not exist on any official record, Dr. Hana Akoro stood before a wall of holographic displays and reviewed the final status reports of Project Prometheus, the most ambitious and most secret military program in human history. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and gray-streaked hair pulled back in a tight knot, and she had spent 23 years of her life in this underground world, building weapons that she prayed would never need to be used. That prayer had not been answered. "Final integration checks are complete across all systems," she told the assembled officers and officials who filled the briefing chamber, members of United Earth Command and the inner circle of the Terran Continuity Congress, the only people in all of human civilization who knew the full scope of what had been built in the dark. She brought up the first display. "Slipstream Drive Mark 7, she said. "Our faster-than-light propulsion system operates at approximately 6 times the speed of the best engines fielded by any Accord species, including the Valith. We can cross the entire buffer zone in hours, not days." She moved to the next display. "Aegis Adaptive Shielding. We reverse-engineered the basic concept from a crashed alien probe recovered 40 years ago near the Kuiper Belt. And then we improved it beyond anything the original builders could have imagined. Aegis does not just absorb incoming weapons fire. It analyzes the energy signature in real time and reflects a calculated portion back at the attacker." Murmurs filled the room, but she was not finished. "FENRIR-class artificial war minds, fully autonomous tactical intelligences capable of coordinating an entire battle group across thousands of kilometers with zero communication delay. Each FENRIR unit can process more tactical data in 1 second than a Valith command crew can handle in an hour." She paused and let that sink in before she revealed the centerpiece. And finally, the Ghost Fleet. The main display lit up with a 3-dimensional map of Sol space, and across it appeared 214 icons representing warships, dreadnoughts, heavy cruisers, strike carriers, and fast-attack corvettes, hidden in the asteroid fields, tucked behind rogue planetoids, drifting in the deep black between orbits, completely invisible to every known sensor technology in the galaxy. 214 combat-ready vessels, Hana said quietly, built in secret over the last 30 years, crewed by personnel who volunteered knowing they might spend their entire careers in hiding. This is the fleet that the galaxy does not know exists. The room was absolutely still. Chancellor Adiz Okonkwo, the elected leader of the Terran Continuity Congress, rose from her chair and looked around the chamber at the faces staring back at her. Soldiers, scientists, politicians, all of them carrying the weight of what was about to happen. "We have spent 80 years inside the cage they built for us," she said, her voice carrying the calm authority that had won her 3 elections. "We entered the accord in good faith, and they used that faith against us. They stole our promised territories. They restricted our growth. They mocked us in their chambers. And when we dared to send a research ship near the edge of our own permitted space, they murdered 412 of our people and called it a misunderstanding." She placed her hands flat on the table. "I am asking this Congress to vote on a motion I never wanted to bring forward: the formal abandonment of Accord compliance and the activation of all Prometheus assets for defensive operations." The vote was not close. 94% voted in favor. It was the most unified political act in human history since the founding of the Terran Congress itself. And when it was done, there was no celebration, only a grim, heavy understanding that the path ahead would be written in fire. 3 days later, Ambassador Alara Voss, still stationed on Thesara Prime with a skeleton crew, received her final orders from Earth. She dressed in her formal diplomatic blacks, walked to the council chamber one last time, and requested an audience. Thalvarin granted it with visible impatience, as if dealing with a child who refused to go to bed. "Ambassador Voss," he said, "have you come to resume your species' participation in civilized governance?" Alara looked up at him, at the creature who had dismissed her 11 times, who had laughed at her people, who had ruled over this chamber like a king presiding over servants, and she smiled. It was not a warm smile. "High Arbiter," she said, "I am here to deliver a formal notice of withdrawal, effective immediately. The Terran Continuity Congress and United Earth Command are terminating all treaties, agreements, and obligations under the Galactic Accord Charter." The chamber erupted, but she raised her voice above the noise. "Attached to this notice, you will find a single message from the people of Earth. I suggest you read it carefully." She transmitted the document to every console in the chamber, and then turned and walked away without waiting for a response, without bowing, without any of the gestures of respect that she had performed 1,000 times before. The message was 1 line long. "You were warned by our patience. You mistook it for weakness." For a moment the chamber was silent, and then the laughter started, first from the Valith delegation, then from their allies, rolling through the seats like a wave. Thalvarin shook his head and gestured dismissively. "Prepare a disciplinary fleet," he told his military advisor. 500 vessels should be more than enough to remind these creatures where they stand in the order of things. We will be at their doorstep within the week." His advisor bowed and left to carry out the order. Across the chamber, the Rithani delegate sat perfectly still, watching everything with compound eyes that missed nothing, and if anyone had been paying attention, they would have noticed that the insectoid was not laughing. The Rithani had studied humans more carefully than any other species in the Accord. They had read the history files, the war records, the detailed accounts of what this small, soft, short-lived species had done to itself over thousands of years of conflict on their little blue world. And the Rithani knew something that Thalvarin and his laughing allies did not. Humans did not bluff. When they went quiet, it was not because they had given up. It was because they were finished talking, and what came after the talking was something that every species in this chamber should have feared far more than they feared the silence. The Rithani delegate transmitted a single encrypted message back to the collective's home system. It contained 2 words: "Prepare shelters." Admiral Thalcora stood on the command bridge of the Valith flagship *Wrath of Dominion and watched her fleet emerge from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol buffer zone. 500 warships stretching across the blackness of space like a wall of teeth and fire. She was the finest military commander the Valith hegemony had produced in 3 generations, decorated in 7 campaigns, feared by every species that had ever been foolish enough to test the hegemony's patience. and she had been given the simplest assignment of her career. "Open a channel to the human homeworld," she ordered, her scaled hands clasped behind her back. The communication officer complied, and Thalcora spoke with the confidence of someone who had never lost a battle and did not intend to start today. "Attention, people of Earth. I am Admiral Thalcora of the Valith Hegemony, commanding the Accord Disciplinary Fleet. You have violated the terms of your membership in the Galactic Accord by withdrawing without authorization, and you are hereby ordered to surrender unconditionally within one standard rotation. Your military leaders will submit themselves for arrest and trial, your fleet will power down and present itself for inspection, and your government will accept whatever terms the Council sees fit to impose. Failure to comply will be met with overwhelming force. This is your only warning." She cut the channel and settled into her command chair. "How long until their response?" she asked her tactical officer. "Unknown, Admiral. We are detecting minimal communication traffic from the inner system." Thalcora frowned slightly, but said nothing. The mammals were probably arguing among themselves about whether to surrender or attempt some pathetic resistance with their handful of outdated frigates. She expected panic, confusion, perhaps a desperate plea for negotiation. What she got was silence, complete, absolute, and unbroken. Hours passed. Her officers shifted uncomfortably at their stations as the deadline approached, and the vast emptiness of space around them offered nothing. No ships, no transmissions, no movement of any kind. It was as if humanity had simply vanished. "Admiral," her sensor officer said carefully, "I am detecting some unusual readings at the edge of our formation. They appear to be sensor echoes, but the patterns are inconsistent with any known phenomenon." Thalcora leaned forward. "Define unusual." "I cannot, Admiral. Our systems keep flagging contacts that disappear before they can be confirmed, as if something is." He never finished the sentence. Exactly 1 hour before the surrender deadline, the darkness around the Valith fleet came alive. 212 human warships materialized out of nothing, not dropping out of faster-than-light travel, not approaching from a distance, but simply appearing where moments before there had been empty vacuum, as if the void itself had opened its eyes. The ghost fleet had arrived. Alarms screamed across every Valith bridge simultaneously as sensors that had shown clear space now showed a killing field. Human dreadnoughts above, heavy cruisers on the flanks, fast attack corvettes threading through the gaps like wolves slipping between the ribs of a giant. Thalcora was on her feet in an instant. All ships' combat formation, raise shields, charge primary weapons, target the nearest. But the humans were already moving, and they were moving at speeds that the Valith tactical computers refused to accept as real. Fleet Admiral Jonah Mwangi sat in the command chair of the TCS Resolve at the center of the human formation, and his face was carved from stone, as the FENRIR War Mind designated Heimdall fed tactical data directly into every ship in the fleet simultaneously. "Heimdall," he said calmly, "execute Hammer and Anvil Variant 3. The AI responded in a voice that was neither warm nor cold but simply precise. "Acknowledged, Admiral. All units are synchronized. Engagement window in 4 seconds. 4 seconds later, the human fleet struck. The Valith had never faced anything like this. Not in 7 campaigns, not in 300 years of military dominance, not in any simulation their war colleges had ever designed. Human ships did not fight the way other species fought. They did not line up in neat formations and exchange fire at range like civilized fleets were supposed to. Instead, they poured through the Valith lines like water through a broken dam, each ship moving independently yet in perfect coordination, guided by FENRIR intelligences that processed the entire battlefield in real time and adjusted every maneuver 1,000 times per second. The Valith opened fire with everything they had: plasma lances, kinetic batteries, torpedo salvos that should have turned the smaller human ships into expanding clouds of debris. The Aegis shields caught it all. Thalcora watched in disbelief as her flagship's main battery, a weapon capable of cracking a small moon, struck a human cruiser dead center, and the energy simply asterisk rippled across the target's hull before a portion of it lanced back at the Valith destroyer that had been flanking the shot, cutting through its armor like a blade through paper. "What kind of shields are those?" she demanded. No one had an answer. The battle, which the galaxy would later call the Battle of the Buffer Line, lasted 11 hours, and every one of those hours carved a deeper wound into the legend of Valith invincibility. The human fleet split the Valith armada into isolated clusters with surgical precision, cutting communication lines, disabling command ships, and then systematically dismantling each cluster with a patience that was almost more terrifying than the violence itself. They did not rage, they performed. 340 Valith ships were destroyed or disabled. Humanity lost 9. When it was over, the remains of the once mighty disciplinary fleet drifted in the dark like broken shells, and the human fleet held position around them in a ring of steel and light. Thalcora stood on her crippled bridge, emergency lighting casting red shadows across the wreckage of consoles and the bodies of her wounded crew, and she gripped the railing with both hands as she stared at the viewport. A human boarding shuttle was approaching, not with weapons hot but with docking lights on, requesting permission to attach. She could have refused, but there was nothing left to fight with. "Let them board," she said quietly. Fleet Admiral Mwangi walked onto the Valith flagship with an escort of 12 Marines in powered armor, but he held no weapon in his hands, and his face showed no triumph, no gloating, no satisfaction. He stopped in front of Thalcora and looked up at her. She was nearly a full meter taller than him, and even defeated she carried herself with the rigid pride of a warrior born. "Admiral Thalcora," he said, "your surviving crew will be given medical attention, and your ships will be repaired enough to make the journey home. You are free to leave." She stared at him as if he had spoken in a language she did not understand. "You are releasing us?" she asked. "I am." "Why?" Mwangi held her gaze without blinking. "Because we are not you," he said simply. "We did not come here to destroy, we came here to make a point, and the point has been made." He reached into his coat and produced a small data chip, which he placed on the shattered remains of her command console. "This is a message for the Council," he said. "Please deliver it personally." Thalcora picked up the chip and turned it over in her clawed fingers. "What does it say?" Mwangi turned to leave, and he paused at the airlock door and looked back at her over his shoulder. "It says, we gave you 80 years of peace, and you spent every one of them sharpening the knife behind your back. Now we have taken the knife, and if you want it back, you will have to earn the right to carry it." He walked out, and the airlock sealed behind him. Thalcora stood alone on her broken bridge and held the chip tightly in her hand, and for the first time in her career, she felt something she had never experienced in battle. Not fear, she knew fear, and this was not it. It was respect. She delivered the message personally, as he had asked. When it played in the council chamber on Thesara Prime, the laughter that had filled that room just weeks before was replaced by a silence so deep that it seemed to swallow the air itself. 3 species withdrew from the accord before the session ended. The galaxy had changed, and it was never going back. The Galactic Accord Council had not known true chaos in over 400 years, but in the 3 months following the Battle of the Buffer Line, it learned the taste of it quickly. The Rithani Collective was the first to leave. Their withdrawal announcement was delivered not with anger or drama, but with the cold precision of a species that thought as one mind, and their statement was exactly 3 sentences long. "We joined this accord believing it served all member species equally. The evidence no longer supports that belief. We wish the remaining members clarity in the difficult days ahead." The Dorvathy Union followed 2 days later, and their departure was louder. Ambassador Kethalo, a massive aquatic being who spoke through a translation membrane stretched across his environmental suit, stood before the chamber and listed 17 specific instances over the past century where the Valith had manipulated trade agreements to benefit themselves at the expense of smaller species. "We stayed because we were afraid," he said, his deep voice echoing off the chamber walls. "And that is the worst reason to stay anywhere." 6 more species withdrew within the week. Thalvarin raged from his elevated seat, threatening sanctions, trade blockades, and military consequences for any species that abandoned the accord, but his threats rang hollow now. The fleet that was supposed to demonstrate Valith power had been shattered by a species the Council had treated as barely more than pets, and everyone in that chamber knew it. The galaxy was watching humanity very carefully, waiting to see what they would do with their victory. What humanity did surprised nearly everyone. Fleet Admiral Mwangi did not press the attack. He did not send the Ghost Fleet roaring into Valith space, did not seize the stolen systems beyond the buffer zone, did not demand tribute or submission or any of the things that every other dominant species in galactic history had done when they found themselves holding the bigger weapon. Instead, he held the line. The former buffer zone was expanded by 200 light-years in every direction, not as an act of conquest, but as the establishment of sovereign Terran space, the territory that should have been humanity's decades ago, and the Ghost Fleet patrolled its borders with quiet efficiency. Any ship that approached peacefully was allowed to pass. Any ship that came with weapons hot was warned once, and only once. The message was simple: we are not your enemy unless you choose to make us one. 3 weeks after the battle, the Terran Continuity Congress broadcast a document on every open channel in the galaxy, the Terran Doctrine Asterisk, and it was written not in the language of war but in the language of invitation. It declared that humanity sought no empire, no vassals, no tribute, and no dominion over any other species. It demanded only 3 things: recognition of human sovereignty over its rightful territory, equal standing with every other spacefaring civilization, and full accountability for the massacre of the Galileo and her crew. The document ended with an open offer. Any species that wished to build a relationship with humanity based on mutual respect and genuine partnership was welcome to send envoys to Earth. The first to arrive were the Rithani. Their delegation landed on Earth's moon and was greeted by Ambassador Ilara Voss, who had returned home after 80 years of thankless diplomacy, finally bearing fruit in the most unexpected way. "We studied your species for a long time," the Rithani lead delegate told her through the hive mind's collective voice, "and we concluded that you were either the most dangerous or the most trustworthy people in this galaxy. We have decided to bet on the second option." Ilara smiled, a real smile this time, warm and tired and grateful. "We will try very hard to make sure that bet pays off," she said. The Dorvathy came next, and then the Pelhari, and then the Yanvari, and then species that humanity had never even spoken to before, small civilizations that had lived under the shadow of the Valith for centuries, and had never dared to imagine a different kind of galaxy. Together, they formed the beginnings of something new, the Sol Compact Asterisk, an alliance built not on the old model of one species ruling over others, but on a charter that guaranteed equal voice, shared defense, and transparent governance. It was fragile and imperfect and held together by hope more than infrastructure, but it was real, and it was growing. And the Valith, watching from behind the crumbling walls of their shrinking accord, grew desperate. Thalvarin convened a secret session with his remaining military commanders and his intelligence chiefs, and in that session, he authorized an operation that would later be considered the greatest strategic mistake in Valith history. A modified freighter, disguised as a neutral trading vessel with forged identification codes, was loaded with a biological weapon, an engineered pathogen designed to target human biology with devastating precision, capable of spreading through air and water systems and killing within days. The freighter was sent toward Earth's orbital stations, hiding among the regular commercial traffic that still moved through the region. It never arrived. 50 years of secrecy had taught humanity the value of watching everything, and Project Argus Asterisk, a network of deep space sensor platforms scattered across human territory like an invisible web, detected the freighter's unusual radiation signature while it was still 3 days from Earth. Captain Lena Schultz, now commanding the patrol frigate TCS Shackleton, intercepted the vessel with a strike team that boarded it within minutes. They found the bioweapon in a shielded cargo container, along with enough evidence to trace its origin directly back to the Valith High Command. Not a rogue operation, not a splinter faction, but an authorized act of attempted genocide signed by Thalvarin himself. The news broke across the galaxy like a thunderclap. Ambassador Voss did not deliver this revelation through diplomatic channels or quiet briefings. She released every piece of evidence simultaneously on every public network accessible to every species in known space. The intercepted orders, the bioweapon analysis, the freighter's navigation logs, Thalvarin's own encrypted authorization, all of it, unedited and undeniable, laid bare for the entire galaxy to see. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Species that had remained loyal to the Valith out of fear or habit or simple inertia abandoned the accord within hours. Even the Korshai, who had been the Valith's closest military ally for 2 centuries, released a statement condemning the bioweapon attack as an act of cowardice unworthy of any civilization that claims the right to exist among the stars. On the Valith homeworld, the revelation shattered the carefully maintained illusion of noble leadership that Thalvarin had built his power upon. His own people turned against him. A coalition of military officers and civilian leaders, led by a young diplomat named Silverin, who happened to be Thalvarin's own daughter, moved against him in a bloodless coup that was over before most of the population knew it had begun. Silverin appeared on public broadcasts within the hour, her scales the same deep emerald as her father's, but her eyes carrying a weight that his had never shown, the weight of shame. "My father led our people down a path of arrogance and cruelty," she said, "and I will not pretend that his removal erases the harm that was done, but I can promise that it ends here." She sent a message to Fleet Admiral Mwangi requesting a ceasefire. Mwangi received the message on the bridge of the TCS Resolve, and he read it twice before responding. "Tell them the ceasefire is granted," he told his communications officer, "on our terms." Captain Schultz, standing beside him, raised an eyebrow. "You think they will accept conditions from us?" Mwangi looked out at the stars, the same stars he had watched on the night the Galileo Memorial had played across every screen on Earth, the night he had decided that humanity was done asking. "They will accept them," he said, "because the alternative is being alone in a galaxy that no longer fears them but no longer trusts them either, and loneliness, Captain, is a prison that no fleet can break out of." The Valith accepted the ceasefire within the day. 1 year after the Battle of the Buffer Line, Ambassador Ilara Voss walked into the Grand Chamber on Thesara Prime for the last time. The room looked the same, the towering seats arranged in their great circle, the vaulted ceiling painted with star maps from 100 different worlds, the soft hum of translation devices waiting to turn a dozen languages into one. But everything about what it meant had changed. The old Galactic Accord was dead. Its charter had been formally dissolved 3 months ago, and the chamber that had once been a throne room for the Valith hegemony was now being prepared for something entirely different. Today was the ratification of the Asterisk Congress of Aligned Worlds Asterisk, A new governing body born from the ashes of the old order, co-authored by humanity, the Rithani Collective, the Dorvathi Union, and 19 other species who had chosen to build something better than what they had torn down. Alara took her seat, not in the lower ring where humanity had always been placed, below the gaze of species that considered themselves superior, but in the main circle, at the same level as every other delegate in the room. It was a small thing, the height of a chair, but it meant everything. Chancellor Adiz Okonkwo addressed the assembly via holographic projection from Earth, her voice filling the chamber with the same steady authority that had guided humanity through the most dangerous year in its history. "We did not seek this moment," she said. "We spent 80 years trying to earn our place through patience, through contribution, through every means that should have been enough in a just system. It was not enough, because the system was never designed to be just." She paused and looked across the faces, human, insectoid, aquatic, crystalline, furred, scaled, all watching her with an attention that would have been unimaginable a year ago. "What we build today must be different, not because we are better than those who came before, but because we have seen what happens when power is allowed to concentrate in the hands of those who believe they deserve it more than others." The new charter was read aloud, article by article, translated into every language spoken by every member species. It established a governing structure with no single hegemon. Votes were weighted by a combination of population and contribution, balanced so that no one species could dominate the proceedings the way the Valith had for centuries. A universal rights charter, drawn heavily from human legal and philosophical traditions, but shaped by input from every founding species, guaranteed protections against exploitation, forced containment, and military aggression between member worlds. It was not perfect, Alara knew that, and so did everyone in the room, but it was honest, and honesty was something the old accord had never offered. When the ratification vote was called, it passed unanimously. Then came the moment that many had thought impossible. Arbiter Silverin of the Valith stepped forward to address the assembly, not as a ruler, not as a conqueror, but as a representative requesting admission to a community that her own people had once tried to dominate. She was young for a Valith leader, barely past her first century, and she carried herself with a dignity that reminded some of her father. But her eyes were different, harder in some ways and softer in others, shaped by the knowledge of exactly what her father's arrogance had cost their people. "I will not stand here and pretend that the Valith hegemony was misunderstood," she said, her voice clear and unhesitating. "We were understood perfectly. We used this council as a tool for our own benefit. We exploited smaller species. We restricted humanity's growth out of fear and greed. We destroyed the Galileo and murdered 412 innocent people. And when we realized we could not win by force, we attempted an act of biological warfare against a civilian population." The chamber was absolutely silent. "These are facts," she continued, "and no amount of time or diplomacy can undo them. But I am here to say that the Valith who committed these acts are not the Valith who stand before you today, and I am asking, not demanding, not expecting, but asking for the chance to prove that." She bowed her head, a gesture that no Valith leader had ever made before another species in recorded history. The Congress voted to admit the Valith as equal members, with conditions: full reparations for the Galileo families, a joint investigation into the bioweapon program, and a 20-year transparency period during which Valith military operations would be subject to independent oversight. Silverin accepted every condition without negotiation. After the ceremony, Fleet Admiral Mwangi held a press conference aboard the TCS Resolve, not to announce a new campaign or a new weapon, but to announce the formal decommissioning of the Ghost Fleet's independent war footing. "These ships were built in secret because we had no choice," he said, standing in his dress uniform with the stars of deep space visible through the viewport behind him. They were crewed by men and women who gave up years of their lives in hidden facilities, never knowing if they would be called upon to fight, hoping that they would not. Today, I am honored to announce that the Ghost Fleet will be restructured as the core of a joint defense force, answerable not to Earth alone, but to the Congress of Aligned Worlds and every species it represents. He paused and allowed himself a rare, small smile. We built these ships to protect ourselves. Now they will protect everyone. Dr. Hana Okoro went even further. She opened the Prometheus Archives ***, the classified research that had given humanity its technological edge, and offered it freely to every member species of the new Congress. The slipstream drive specifications, the Aegis shielding blueprints, the FENRIR coordination algorithms, all of it, shared without restriction with only one condition: that the technology be used for defense and exploration, never for domination. Secrets are a kind of weapon, she told the assembly when she presented the archives, and we have had enough of weapons. This knowledge belongs to all of us now. The Rithani delegate, the same one who had sent the encrypted warning to prepare shelters a year ago, approached Hana after the presentation and studied her with those vast compound eyes. You could have kept this advantage for yourselves, the delegate said. It would have made you the most powerful species in the galaxy for generations. Hana looked at the alien and shook her head gently. Power that depends on keeping others weak is not power, she said. It is fear wearing a crown. We have seen what that looks like, and we want no part of it. Later that evening, when the ceremonies were over and the delegates had dispersed to their ships and their quarters, Alara Voss found herself alone on the observation deck of Thesara Prime. She stood at the vast window and watched the traffic of a dozen species vessels passing through the station's space. Rithani carriers with their geometric hulls, Dorvathi waterships trailing bioluminescent wakes, sleek Pelhari scouts, and sturdy human cruisers all moving together in a pattern that looked almost like a dance. A quiet clicking sound behind her announced the arrival of the Rithani delegate. Ambassador Voss, the delegate said, settling beside her at the window, may I ask you a question that has occupied the collective's analysis for some time? Of course. Do your people regret abandoning peace? Alara watched a human frigate pass alongside a Valith transport, two ships that a year ago would have been trying to destroy each other, now sharing the same lane as casually as neighbors walking down the same street. We never abandoned peace, she said softly. We abandoned the lie that submission was the same thing. What we have now, this thing that we are building together with all of you, this is the first real peace any of us have known. The Rithani considered this for a long moment, then dipped their head in what Alara had learned was a gesture of profound agreement. Far away on Earth, in a coastal city that had spent the last year holding its breath and was only now beginning to exhale, a little girl stood on a rooftop with her father and looked up at the night sky. It was clear tonight, clearer than it had been in weeks, and the darkness above was scattered with stars. But among those stars, there were new lights moving slowly and steadily across the heavens. The running lights of allied ships in orbit, vessels from a dozen worlds keeping watch together over the small blue planet that had changed everything. Papa, the girl said, tugging on his sleeve and pointing upward, what are those lights? Her father lifted her onto his shoulders so she could see better, and he looked up at the sky with eyes that held the memory of fear and the fragile warmth of something new. Those are our friends, he said. It took a very long time to find them, but they are here now. The girl watched the lights move across the stars and smiled, and above her the ships of the Congress of Aligned Worlds sailed on through the dark, not as conquerors, not as subjects, not as rivals, but as neighbors who had finally learned, after centuries of making every other choice first, that the bravest thing any species could do was not to fight. It was to trust. And humanity, stubborn, scarred, fierce, and gentle humanity, had taught them how.